How many of you come across this?
Oh, that's. Yeah, I know, I'm sitting with my colleague. I bought it years back in the with this guy. I'm raw yellow. It's that recently. Wow.
Well, that's interesting. That's not something I follow much of. Because I studied that in college.
Oh, this is so good. And I have with that.
So that's all.
Like I don't feel like. Oh, I want to know.
We can play it.
Yeah.
They weren't all
every year.
really wasn't.
No, I give you that.
What?
Trying to play.
Yes, I do.
We're gonna pretend in here. So maybe you can all pretend you're cheering. Today. There's pretty good membership and either of which, yeah, I can't do this. If somebody want to write things down.
It sounds simple. It's somebody.
Yeah, I know.
Problem is reading it later. Yeah, that's my problem. Well, welcome. And I know you're all eating your scones now. Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. So today today's part 3 of our session on kind of an introduction to the Bible. And if you were here the first week, I kind of gathered some questions from you about the things that you wanted to talk about. And those things are things that we're talking about yesterday or last week. So we're going to talk through 4 handouts today. And then I've got some questions for you on the things that you'd like to, have Bible studies about in the fall. And so we'll finish off with that. And what do you want to do in the fall? So, last week we started this one called Books of the Bible. I made some extra copies. Anybody need a copy? Books of the Bible, anyone? I got a couple here. Good catch. They did that on purpose. And then, so anyway, we'll start on that one. So, we kind of talked, we started this one last week. And, this is basically the categories of the Bible, in the English Bibles. We kind of lump our Bible books together into groups. The first book, or the first category is Genesis. I'm sorry. First category is the law, and that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And that's looking at how the covenant works. God gave a covenant to Abraham in Genesis 12, that he was going to make a great people out of them, and these people were going to unify the world back to God. And so the first 5 books of the Bible is pretty much just watching that play out. The second one is books of history, and that's kind of the stuff that happened to the Jews as they went from slavery in Egypt to wandering in the wilderness for years, getting into the land of Canaan, all the adventures they had after that. We call it books of, in the English Bible, we call it the books of history. And but it's important to remember that it's not meant to be history like somebody was walking around with a video camera and then transcribing it. It's meant to be stories that told the Jews who they were. And so that's, we call that reflective history. It's stories that give them a sense of who they are and what their mission is in the world. So the third category, poetry, and Job and Psalms and Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs, and as you might expect, these books are all poetry, which is why we get the name. Major prophets and minor prophets, and these were the guys that took God's word and spoke it to a people who needed it. A lot of times it was people who were pretentious and certain of their views, and the prophets cut them down a bit. Sometimes it was they spoke to a people who were hurting and wondering where God was. And when the prophets spoke to those people and gave them words of comfort. So, and you all remember the difference between minor prophets and major prophets? Shorter. Minor prophets are shorter. In the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that's really the center of the Bible as far as Lutherans are concerned, is the life and the teachings of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because they have a lot of the same stories in them. John is a different animal entirely. John is kind of a theological analysis of Jesus' ministry, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke are just kind of Jesus did this, and then he did this, and then he said this. History is the next one, and there's only one book there, the Acts. And the first half of the book of Acts is about Peter. Second half is about Paul. And Paul went on 4 missionary journeys. And those are recorded in the second half of the book of Acts. And the book of Acts ends with Paul in Rome. And so the book is really, the whole book is really about how the gospel got from Jerusalem, center of the Jewish world, to Rome, the center of the rest of the world. So, the next section there is Paul's letters. And Paul wrote these letters to churches while he and his colleagues wrote them to churches while he was on these missionary journeys. Some of them are like Philippians are very warm and compassionate, and he loved these people. And other ones, like Galatians, they were starting to believe false doctrine, and Paul goes, "What are you doing?" So there's a lot of differences in tone in these letters, depending on the situation that the church is in. Other letters, these are the letters not written by Paul: Hebrews, James, Peter, James, and John, and Jude. And then the book of Revelation, which you all know that one. That's the final book. That's the one that, you know, it's one with the seas turning to blood and stars falling from the sky and cats and dogs living together. That's really that's a style of writing which was common in those years, called apocalyptic literature, and it's meant, believe it or not, it's meant to bring hope to people that are struggling. And we've all seen movies about the book of Revelation, and they're all wrong. So it's meant to bring hope. So let me stop there for a minute. Any questions about this? On how this is arranged? What's questions on anything so far? Okay, let me ask you a question. Can you take down your answers? Chuck's gonna write down all your answers.
There'll be a grade that you do.
Yeah, great. That's okay. Great. Let's college professors. Great. Of these other books of the Bible, or maybe the categories of the books, which ones are most familiar to you? Which ones do you kind of know? If you had to start reading, you'd be okay.
New Testament.
New Testament, sure.
Poetry.
Poetry. Yeah, the Psalms and stuff. Everybody loves the Psalms.
I would say the Gospels.
Gospels, yeah.
And we hear them every
Right.
week.
Right. Good. Anybody else? Genesis. Yeah. Everybody kind of knows at least the first half of Genesis, because we all start reading in Genesis and then we give up after a while. Especially in Leviticus.
When my grandmother in her final weeks of life was telling my aunt about how she read all of the books of the Bible, even Leviticus.
The New Testament after the Gospels, which is the journey of Christianity and how it's growing.
Okay, good. Okay, let me change the question now. Which part of this is most unfamiliar to you? What would you kind of struggle with if you had to read it?
Minor prophets.
Minor prophets. How come? Yeah, we don't read the minor prophets much in church, and not many sermons on. Amos is one of my favorite books.
And got some good versions here.
Yeah, we got good versions there. Yeah.
The book of Jude.
Jude. Yeah, nobody gets that.
No.
That's why we don't.
Yeah.
There's no Bible studies on Jude.
No.
Anybody else?
Joel, I'm gonna say Joel because I never understand Joel.
Job?
Yeah, and
Wow.
explain how that's poetry.
Yeah, Job's another great one that's always misunderstood because people only read the first two chapters. And if you only read the first two chapters, you come away thinking, wow, Job is really patient. And we always hear about that Job, patience of Job. The rest of the book of Job is Job being really impatient. Not at all patient. And so, and the book of the book has nothing to do with patience. So it's one of those books that we constantly miss the point of. You say, did you ever hand up? Or?
No, just, it's not particularly poetry, but it's structured like a play, it's more of a script.
That's a nice way to put it, yeah.
Revelation.
Revelation, yeah, that's a tough one. It's my favorite book. But because it's such words of hope, but we don't, we don't really have anything like apocalyptic literature in our society, and so we struggle with it. The only thing that's the closest thing we have to apocalyptic literature is music videos. Because you watch them and it's supposed to make you feel something. Right? It's not meant to be taken literally, it's meant to make you feel something. And that's what apocalyptic literature is, it's supposed to make you feel.
I would like to have a class on Revelation too. Yeah, because I'll be honest, I have not read it, I just kind of go, yep. Come on,
There it is.
go somewhere else to get it or get over it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to, I would love to help you.
Isn't it used by other groups to say?
Yeah.
That's like,
Yeah.
that's why I'd like to know more about it, because they use it in such a negative way.
Yeah, they use it in an angry way, don't they? Yeah. And that's not the point of Revelation at all, but if you take the book of Revelation literally, like some places do, then it's a really angry, scary word. And interestingly, one of the fears the early church fathers and mothers had about the book of Revelation is they were afraid people would take it too seriously, or take it too literally. Yeah, guess what happened? They read it to be literally.
I'll offer up the book of Jonah as being misunderstood because people think it's a fish story.
Yeah, that's a great one. Jonah's another great one that we get stuck on. Was he really, swallowed by a fish? And we miss, and if we get stuck on that, then we miss the point of the story. I told Pastor Sarah that I would be happy in the fall to do a series of Bible studies called Bible Study for Adults, where we take a look at some of the. Let me rephrase that. Because sometimes we learn Bible stories in Sunday school, and that's all the further we've ever got, and sometimes it pays to take it. Like Jonah, and say, here's what it really meant. And so anyway. Okay, well that's good. Thank you for writing down those answers. Let's jump to the next handout, the one called Main Events of the Old Testament. And I have some extras here. And do we have any extras? Here's the next one. Go ahead. Sorry, Jim. That's okay. I'm good. I got you. You got yours. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh. Very well, thank you. All right, so in this one, what I did is one of the things that people expressed in the first week is kind of they needed some kind of a timeline for what happened in the Bible, and so I put together this for the Old Testament. So it's 14 of it, maybe 13, I don't know how many, there's a number of events here. That are kind of the main points of the Old Testament, the main milestones as it goes forward. First one, and we talked about this already, is the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12. God lays out a mission for his people, which is unify all peoples back to be. Okay. And the rest of the Old Testament is sometimes they did that well, and sometimes they did that poorly. Red Sea, I listed for each of these the kind of the probable date, main person involved, why it's important, and the books of the Bible. And the dates, you know, some people disagree with. There's like 4 main dates that people think the Red Sea happened in. I think it was 1290. Somebody else may think something different, so whatever. They after the Red Sea, they got through that, and they moved, the people moved to Mount Sinai, where they got the covenant. And the covenant was a different covenant than God gave to Abraham. I'm looking at the time. Do we really? Let's skip that. The next thing after they got done with the Mount Sinai, they got the covenant, they got the 10 Commandments. You remember Charlton Heston came down with, Moses came down with the tablets. And then they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And then they got into Palestine. And God told them, when you get into Palestine, don't worship their gods. Their gods were called the Baals. The Canaanite gods were called the Baals. And God said, when you get there, don't worship the Baals. Well, 15 minutes after they get into the country, guess what? They started worshiping the Baals. So there was unfaithfulness. And then they were unfaithful, and then they got oppressed by other people, and then they said, God, we need help, and God would send the judge, and the judge would lead them, and everything is good, and then they go back to worshiping the Baals again. So finally, in the book of 1 Samuel, the people say, we want a king. And God said, no, I'm your king. And they said, yeah, but we really want a king. We really want a human king. And so God gave them Saul. He was the first king. He was kind of a king over the northern tribes. Remember, the 12 tribes were all in Palestine. There were kind of 10 tribes in the northern and 2 tribes in the southern part. He was kind of in charge of the northern. King David started about 1000 BC as king. He was the first one to get all 12 tribes, both the north and the south. King David told God, I want to build you a temple. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God says, well, that's awfully nice, David, but I don't want a temple. I kind of like moving among my people, and I don't want to get stuck in the back room of some temple. And next thing you know, Solomon is building a temple and sticks God in the back room of the temple, called the Holy of Holies. So after
Quick question, for all of these books, is there archaeological evidence of some of these kings and rulers that, aside from the Bible, that?
The later we get, the more archaeological evidence there is. Not Saul, I'm not aware of anyone on Saul. There might be one on David. It's just a kind of a broken tablet. But once we get later, we get more archaeology.
Thanks.
There's a great magazine called Biblical Archaeology Review, and they have a great website too.
Yeah, yeah, great, a lot of free,
The latest
a lot of free stuff on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, good, thanks. So Solomon had a terribly brutal rule. He enslaved his own people. He taxed the people more than they could possibly bear. And after he died, the people said to the next king, who was Solomon's son, you gotta help us. We can't afford this tax burden. And he said, no, I'm gonna be worse. So the country split into two, the northern tribes and the southern tribes. The northern tribes were Israel and the southern was Judah. In 721 BCE, Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians, and that's the last we hear of them. The prophets came in the years about 800 to 500, and their main message was return to God. Babylonian exile, we talked about that on week 1. That's where the Babylonians took over Judah, and they, in order to prevent revolts, they brought a lot of people out of Jerusalem and took them to Babylon. They had to live there. They were there for about 50 years. And Ezra, in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, they returned to Judah after 50 years. And then we got the intertestamental period where the priests pretty much pushed 4 ideas. That God only dwells in the temple. You gotta obey the laws, all 750 laws in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We're the chosen people, and sometimes when they said the chosen people, they meant we're God's instrument to bring unity back to God, which is what God wanted. And sometimes chosenness meant we have to stay separate from all those other people. Which is absolutely not what God wanted. And the 4th one is that the Messiah is coming. So let me ask you questions first on how this timeline goes.
One question. You're saying about Judah, after 50 years in exile, the people returned to Judah, to the people of 2 tribes of Judah?
Right.
What happened to the other 10 tribes? They were the opposite, right?
That's a great question. So they were living in the north. The other 10 tribes were living in the north. And they were in 721, the Assyrians came through and destroyed, just flattened the entire country. And the Assyrians were kind of a brutal people. They weren't nice like the Babylonians. And so they took a lot of people out of the land, and then they brought in a lot of their own people. So the Assyrians came in and lived there. So you had Assyrians living with, who were the most hated people ever. Living next to all the Israelites, and they intermarried and had lots of little children, and so collectively then, that by the time the New Testament came around, that was called Samaria. Okay. So we had the Jews, the Judah Jews, hated the Israelites, and they hated the Assyrians even more. And then they intermarried. What do you think they thought about the Samaritans?
No good.
There was never a good Samaritan. And then Jesus comes along and talks about the Good Samaritan. There was no such thing as a good Samaritan as far as the people were concerned. So, good, yeah. Any other questions?
Just a comment on that. the Jews, after the exile, never lost sight of the land that Israel occupied in the north because those land rights were spelled out in the Torah. So they sought to reclaim the whole territory, all 12 tribes.
And they finally did in the New Testament times under some of the things that kind of, the Romans allowed them to have some control over the northern tribes. Good. So let me ask you, what parts of the Old Testament here are the least familiar? Maybe it's something I said that you went, what? Or you've never read this part, or you can take it. Chuck, you got your pen ready?
I'm ready. We've already talked about the books that are unfamiliar.
Right.
And now you want the
time of it, the timeline, any parts of this?
Well, just for clarification, when was Joseph? Before those Babylonians or?
Joseph, the,
Technology?
the Technicolor dream.
Kids, the parents of the time.
Yes.
So he was way back.
He was way back, he was there with Abraham's.
I'm getting.
Yeah, that's good.
Can you get Danny Osmond to come tell us about it?
Pardon?
Danny Osmond to come tell us about it? Sing a few songs here and there?
He doesn't return my calls anymore.
He's retired,
I guess what I'm really wondering is, because the Jewish people of today are very all about, justice. And it seems like back in the day, they were doing all kinds of, so when did that evolve? Is that after Jesus, or was it during that
Yeah,
horrible time?
well, I think there was always, there was always a segment of Judaism that really wanted that justice. And so there's always been kind of different factions of Judaism, kind of like Christianity. There's 40,000 different denominations in Christianity, and kind of Jews were like that too. So there's never been just one people, the Jews. Let's move on quick to books not in the Protestant Bibles. One of the questions from the first week was, why do the Roman Catholics have some books in their Bibles that aren't in the Protestant Bibles? And it started, there's 14 books that the Roman Catholics have that aren't in our Bibles. You see, you're counting there. It's not 14, is there? Because I forgot to put some in there. I'm missing a couple, so sorry. I realized that this morning. I was looking at, why is there 14? So, and sometimes, when you see it, sometimes the books are ordered differently. They'll have, Bellow the Dragon will have 2 parts and things like that. So it's not always because I forgot. I mean, sometimes it's a little messy.
Sounds like a Disney movie.
Pardon?
Belle of the Dragon.
So I'll tell you how the Roman Catholics got their books. Back in the year 380, the Pope comes up to a guy by the name of Jerome, who was the smartest man in the land, and said, "I'd like you to translate the Bible into the language," or actually he said, "I'd like you to translate the Gospels into the language of the people," which was Latin at that time. And Jerome says, "Well, if I'm going to do the Gospels, I might as well do the whole book, the whole Bible." So he translated the whole Bible into Latin, and and that's the first time it had ever been in the language of the people. It was always Greek and Hebrew before that. And he wrote an introduction to each book of the Bible. And in the books that we call the Apocrypha, those 14 books, he wrote in his introduction that these really aren't scripture, but they're pretty good books, you know, and so we're just gonna put them in there. And his Latin version of the Bible was translated for the next, or I'm sorry, it was copied over the next 1,000 years. And a lot of times when they copied his translation, they didn't put in the introductions. Because, you know, parchment was expensive and so they wanted to save time. And so what happened is these books just kind of became part of what the natural Bible was like. Until Luther came along. And Luther looked at these particular books and said, number one, they were never translated, they were never cited by the New Testament. They were never accepted by the Jewish scholars, or the church fathers and mothers, our own church fathers and mothers. And thirdly, there were some passages in there that kind of made Luther uncomfortable. There's a passage in one of the books about praying for the dead. Another passage about giving money to get forgiveness of sins, giving money to the church. And so that kind of really, that stuff made Luther uncomfortable. So what he did is he put them in the center of in between the testaments, lumped them all together and said, these books aren't inspired, but they're pretty good books. And so they're good for devotional reading, but it's not scripture. And about 100 years later, the English did the King James version of the Bible. And they translated it into English. And they went a little further than Luther did. The English said, yeah, we're not going to put those books in there because they don't do anything. So so they were kind of taken out of all the Protestant Bibles. And even though the Roman Catholics still liked those books. So today, Jewish authority, you know, the Jewish rabbis say, yeah, they've never been a part of our culture. Lutherans say, well, they're good books, but they're not scripture. And Roman Catholics say they're inspired, but they're not quite as inspired as the rest of them. And so that's kind of where we are now, is you know, they're fine books, but not scripture. So questions about that? Okay, we got 5 minutes left. Let me, we're gonna skip that third one, even though I know you guys wanted to talk. I want to hear a couple things about what you want to talk about in fall. A lot of times we talk about 3 different ways to go about doing Bible study. Starting with the Bible, starting with, you know, my life, my spiritual life, my life, and just trying to get through the day, things that go on in my life, or issues that are prevalent today. And there's a lot of overlap in between these, right? Because if you're talking about my life, you're always going to refer to the Bible. But the question is, where do you want to start? You know, it's kind of the question, where do you start? Where do you focus on first? Does anybody have any feelings about what they would like to study as far as these 3 ideas? Go.
Jim, I can't read all of the ideas. I just see Bible on the top. What are the other 2?
My life, like my spiritual life, or you know, my emotional life, my life with the family. Issues is things that are happening in the world. It might be Christian nationalism, or it might be hunger, or whatever kind of issues.
Yeah. I think one thing that I've been wrestling with lately, especially with friends, where we're having talk about Christianity, is with everything going on today. A lot of people feel like the church in general, Christianity is in general, is not acting very Christian.
Yeah.
And people want nothing to do with it.
Right.
So in light of that, I mean, it makes me, as I try and defend where am now, how do we reach out loving, with compassion?
Force somebody to believe.
Just to it's kind of like the Geico or whatever commercial, it wasn't Geico, with the woman, on the wall posting and said, things for saying that it was like Facebook and she was putting it on her page. And it's like, no, it's not like that. That's not right.
Yeah.
I guess is how do you have those conversations with folks to say, this really isn't, this really. Well, it's not even about us, but
Well, kind of, but
yeah.
that's a great comment. You got that?
I got it.
Oh, good.
Yeah, that's at the issue side, I guess. Yeah.
I'd like to dwell on some topics where people say that politicians are talking about a lot of issues that are relative to church, and they're saying, we don't want to hear about politics in church. And I think that there is a gray area between, we're talking about the Bible and biblical issues, but a lot of times people say, no, that's political and we shouldn't talk about that here. So I'd like to explore the boundaries between politics and religion.
That's a good, yeah, because,
Even political.
yeah, well, Jesus talked a lot about politics, right? Yeah. You got that?
Is that difference, aggravated by what legal thing of separation of church and state? To keep the tax exempt thing for churches?
Yeah.
You can write it down, Chuck. Tax exempted.
The difference between Christian religions.
You mean like Catholics versus Lutherans and that kind of stuff?
And Southern Baptists.
Southern Baptists, yeah,
Oh, well,
that's good.
the book is, might be in
And
the
their
library.
interpretations versus what I have learned and what I respect or what I believe.
Right.
Divided Methodist.
What else?
Okay, mine was, does differing Protestant theology or seminaries influence the words used in Bible translations? As in, I really can't talk to people down in Texas about religion,
Okay, good.
unless they're from Minnesota at Holy Cross.
Okay, good.
I like the general theme that's emerging, religion in America. From probably the mid-19th century with the rise of the Arminian theory and the whole smoking trial in the 20s and the rise of American fundamentalism versus progressive Christianity. I'd still like to keep focused while we're talking about that on how the overarching principles of the Bible speak to us, maybe to those that aren't like us. What are those overarching principles that we really need to embrace?
Good, nice.
Yeah.
You got that, Chuck? We had one more.
Well, we struggle with John 14:6, which is, as Christians, we struggle with that. That Jesus is the only way, right? Yeah. Which is what he's talking about too, other religions and so forth. Where do they fit in if Jesus is the only way?
Yeah, and what did Jesus mean? Because I'm pretty sure he wasn't being imperial, that,
Right.
you can only if you believe exactly, this or that. Yeah.
Well, and in that same vein, how we pick and choose various verses out of the Bible to prove our point. That, for example, homosexuality is just terrible, and because we picked this out of, I forgot what it was.
The book nobody reads.
Yeah.
Right. Good. You got that? All right, well, I want to get you out of here at 11:30, so, thank you very much for. And, there is an evaluation of all the forums on the table there, so if you would like to take one of those, leave that back to the church office, that would be great.
It's also online too. I think.
Is it online?
I filled it out.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody.
One more announcement, there are more schools. If you've already. Oh.
So I thought I'd come in here and hang out a bit. Oh, it's our.
Say here.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Yeah, so nice to see you. See you. Take that.
Glad you're feeling better.